Welcome to Global Finance Rewired, the podcast series where we explore reforms to the international financial architecture. Today, we're going to take a closer look at an important region, the African region. It's a region where we see a lot of dynamic recently, dynamic in the sense that we have a lot of developments on regional level, and we also have a lot of political momentum from African governments pushing reforms on multilateral level, pushing reforms in the international financial architecture. I have the pleasure to welcome a distinguished expert today to our podcast. It's Jason Braganza. Jason is the Executive Director of AFRODAD. AFRODAD is the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development. And Jason has been involved in advocacy and research on international financial architecture reform for many years. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Jason, today.
Hi, Bodo. Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be part of this podcast series, and looking forward to a very exciting conversation around debt on the continent.
Great. Let's jump right in. African governments are taking a lot of initiative on regional level. This makes people think, what's wrong with the international financial architecture? Why is there so much momentum on regional level? Why does the international financial architecture does not work for Africa? Why do countries, governments, civil society in Africa think that you have to build alternatives?
Yeah, it's a very good question and a very pertinent one. I think you can begin to answer this question in three levels, right? The first one is to look at the design of the international financial architecture and just try to trace back its origins at the time when institutions like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and such like were established. Many African countries were still colonies of Western European countries. And so very, very few of them were involved in the design, in the architecture and the governance framework of how these institutions were going to be governed and run. And so the rules of the game as such were to favor the countries that established these institutions, but also largely to support the reconstruction and development of post-war Europe to a very large extent. The second reason is because the current or the prevailing international financial architecture has really, progressed in the sense that promotes extractivism as a form of economic activity and economic engagement, right? So in this sense, it has relegated the African continent to a supplier of raw materials and extractivism. And then third and finally, where we have had attempts to try and change things, they have been in piecemeal versions, right? So we've had, for example, in the early 2000s, we had the debt cancellation movement, which was, in a principal point of view, a very good idea, but a very isolated initiative, right? Because it didn't take into account issues around the broader economic structure of many African countries that did benefit from the debt cancellation. And we know 25 years later, we find ourselves in a similar situation. So in this regard, the international financial architecture really has not responded and continues not to respond to the evolving nature of Africa as a continent interacting in this global system. And that's why we have more regional focused interventions, such as establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area, the establishment of the high-level panel on illicit financial flows, and now more recently, some conversations about creating an African debt monitoring mechanism to try and deal with some of the challenges affecting the continent when it comes to economic development and economic transformation.
Let me throw in one buzzword. The cost of capital has been mentioned very often also. This year, South Africa, an African country, has the G20 presidency. It's the first time since the founding of the G20. And South Africa, especially in the beginnings, has put cost of capital high on the agenda. And that has also featured a lot the debate of cost of capital at the fourth International Conference on Financing for Development in Sevilla earlier this year. Africa has the highest cost of capital among all the regions. Can you explain what the consequences are, or why this is such a challenge for Africa's development?
Yeah, I think it's linked to the point I was making about how the global financial architecture has been designed, right? It has been designed in a way to sort of suppress the progress of the continent in different ways, and also, in ways that can actually promote confidence and give potential investors, those that are involved in development finance or any form of finance for that matter, confidence that their investment in the continent is going to be safe, it's going to provide a return on investment, and that there's going to be low risk associated with investing in the continent. Now, you may look at the cost of capital in a different set of ways, right? The risk appetite for investors means that they want some sort of assurance that whatever they invest in the continent is going to come back. And this is correct. I mean, anywhere in the world that you would go to, an investor wants to understand that the risk ratios that are involved. Now, unfortunately, the methodologies that are used to calculate these risk ratios tend to be a little bit biased. They tend to sort of preserve the narrative that Africa is a high cost, high risk investment region, when in fact, it's very plausible to be able to lower the cost of capital on the continent. Secondly, there has been also, no attempt to support any form of development of capital markets on the continent, and create this system of dependency on international foreign capital markets as the source of investment. And of course, when you do something like that, or when you externalize finance in that sense, there's always a risk premium that is going to be associated with that. And so when the African Union Commission is embarking on some of these initiatives to try and lower the cost of capital, I think it's important that we should support these kinds of initiatives to bring it down. And then lastly is the issue of the rating agencies that are associated with governing how the cost of capital is computed. The methodologies are often very opaque, but also sometimes informed by experts who do not necessarily have the regional expertise and the regional nuance of how certain investments and business operations take place on the continent. And so they ignore certain nuances and certain salient points on how business is done on the continent, and through that lack of experience or lack of awareness tend to price up the cost of capital on the continent. And lastly, and most importantly also, I think we need to look at it from a political economy perspective as well. What are the consequences of making capital more accessible to the African continent? What does that actually mean for the economic transformation of a continent that has a population of over 1 billion people? What would happen if the continent all of a sudden evolved and transformed from being a primary commodity export dependent region to one that's producing finished goods, luxury goods for the global market? We also need to consider those types of pressures as well that tend to lock out or try to suppress the emergence of the continent in order to keep it in this perpetual state of dependency, if you like, and hence maintaining the cost of capital, I think in some cases, to being 4 times the amount that might be borrowed relative to other regions like Latin America or Asia.
Let me pick just one element from your answer, from your analysis, which is credit ratings or credit rating agencies. Obviously, the credit rating is one of the factors that very much influences the cost, the price of a bond, or the risk premium that a country has to pay when it borrows on financial markets. At the moment, there are only 3 big players on the field that dominate the credit rating markets, and there's a lot of criticism how they work. I understand it, particularly from Africa. So there has been an initiative recently by the African Union to set up a regional African credit rating agency. To my understanding, it should become operational in September this year, so it should start operating soon. Can you explain a little bit how it is going to work, and what's your verdict on it? Is it going to solve the problem, or what do you think about it?
Absolutely. I think this is a fantastic example of what the continent is doing to address some of the inefficiencies and well-known and well-documented ineffectiveness of the prevailing international architecture, right? The African Union heads of state decision to establish its own regional credit rating agency 2 years ago is something that has been very much welcome, both from a political point of view in terms of saying we are going to try and do this on our own and have our own context. And so in that regard, I'm very, very pleased that it has made very good progress. I'm very much looking forward to how it's going to play out. My sincere hope is that it's not a replication in some sense of the big three that you've mentioned that dominates the market, and that there are certain salient points and nuances in the methodology that have been taken into account to develop this regional credit rating agency. Of course, there are sort of independent national level credit rating agencies across the continent, in Mauritius, in South Africa, that do this kind of work, but they largely rely on the methodologies of the big three. So, really excited to see what the African Union's version of the credit rating agency might look like. Certainly, I know that there has been ideas of trying to look at how to ensure the methodology takes into account the informality of our economies. That's a big feature of our economic structure on the continent at the moment. There's been, ways of looking into the issues of different types of shocks and how we attribute risk and these shocks together, whether it's political, whether it's climatic, whether it's environmental, or whether it's economic, and so on. So, lots of exciting opportunities that this rating agency brings to the table, but also more importantly, I do hope at some level in the medium term, it will help challenge the monopoly or oligopolistic nature of the ratings ecosystem as it currently stands.
Great. And shocks, indeed. I mean, shocks is a second issue. I mean, obviously, each country is vulnerable to shocks. African countries, I think many particular due to natural disasters or dependency on very few export goods. I mean, one of the reasons for the high risk premiums is that investors fear to lose their money, that there might be a default on that basis. And there should, of course, be a shock absorber, the International Monetary Fund, which should provide liquidity in times of these exceptional situations. Many countries don't like the IMF for a number of reasons, mostly related to the onerous conditionality that comes along with IMF loans. So I remember that during the Euro crisis, even Europe set up a regional alternative, which was called the European Stability Mechanism, because the Europeans didn't want the IMF to operate in Europe either. So I understand a similar thing is going on in Africa at the moment with the African Financial Stability Mechanism, right? So how is this? What's your view on this? Is this going to be an effective instrument?
I think so, absolutely. And I think, the importance again of these initiatives is to showcase that the current ecosystem is not working for Africa's transformation agenda 2063, and that more importantly, the geopolitical moment that we find ourselves in right now requires us to sort of think a little bit outside the box that we've become very comfortable with, right? And so the establishment of this African Financial Stability Board mechanism is a way of showcasing that we have been observing over time how other regions have gone about creating these macroeconomic buffers, if you like, when we are exposed to different types of shocks. And as you can see, the vulnerability of the continent to different types of shocks, not just economic or political shocks, climatic shocks, conflict shocks that are outside of the continent. These impacts are directly being felt on the continent. And so the idea of establishing this financial stability mechanism is a way of just demonstrating that we are learning our lessons. We are learning that we are part of a globalized ecosystem, but in the last 20 to 30 years in this globalized system, we have not had our own shock absorbers. We've had to rely on external shock absorbers, as you say, in the form of the IMF, in the form of the World Bank, in some cases, in the form of bilateral relations. But in the current geopolitical context, these relations and these shock absorbers are beginning to decline and decrease at a very alarming rate. And so, the level of exposure that the continent is now going to be facing moving forward is extremely high. So something like the African Financial Stability Mechanism is very welcome. Again, I do believe that there are some elements that needs to be introduced that Africanize it. And so it's not just a matter of copy pasting a template from one place to another. So it is something that is very much welcome. And I do also hope that African Union member states will find the appropriate home for it, perhaps in the African Development Bank or somewhere else, where it can actually be able to serve its appropriate purpose in protecting the macroeconomic fiscal environment for the continent during times of periodic shocks and so on.
Okay. Perhaps let's come to one last topic, because, this is more a multi-level topic, but African countries, African governments increasingly took the role of rule makers, not just on the regional level, but they also start to drive initiatives on global level, filling a void, a gap, I think, that has been left because other regions stopped doing so. This was the case, in the case of the UN Tax Convention, of course, which has just started negotiations. But in the run-up to the Sevilla conference, the Financing for Development conference, African governments also promoted the idea of a UN debt convention. What's the purpose of the convention, and why are we doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, sort of responding to the inadequacies of the prevailing debt restructuring processes that are available, but also an inaccurate diagnosis of the debt crisis on the continent. It's not just being about liquidity, but also a solvency issue where, many African countries are not struggling to access cash, as we've talked about with regard to the cost of capital. The issue is that they're not in a position to generate the revenues because, the economic system that they operate in does not allow them to move up value chains and move up the supply chains and to transform their economies. And so we've seen, during the COVID-19 pandemic, where many countries' debt positions accelerated away from moderate to high to actually being in distress. Since the pandemic, we've had 4 African countries that have defaulted on their debt. This is Zambia, Ghana, Ethiopia, and Chad. And we've got many other countries that are really teetering on the edge of a default and needing to restructure. Now, the initiative that was introduced by the G20, which is the common framework for debt restructuring and similar treatment of debt issues, unfortunately has not delivered both in substance, in fiscal space, and in process. And this has left many African governments and African policymakers wondering, what else can we do, and what else should we be doing to change the international system around debt architecture and debt governance. And this is where the idea of the UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt sort of was born, if you like, just slightly over a year ago when we started the process towards the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development. It brings together different ideas, right from the global governance system all the way down to national debt management on transparency and accountability. It also aims to be a normative framework that changes the behavior of the actors within debt architecture. This is both lenders, credit rating agencies, oversight institutions, and the borrowers. So the idea is to have, a convention that provides all this different type of governance and normative frameworks for all the actors in the ecosystem around debt governance. So we did start off with that, and at the end of the journey of getting to the Sevilla meeting for the Financing for Development conference, the outcome document, the compromiso, we did eventually get some very progressive language on the possibility of creating this UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt through the language that includes an intergovernmental process to discuss issues of debt. And this, again, largely driven by, as you said, the African Union and the African Union member states, who just a month before Sevilla had a debt conference in Togo and came up with the Lomé Declaration that actually gave the impetus for the final push in the negotiations to get that language on an intergovernmental process on debt, which hopefully in the medium term will take us down the path of getting eventually a UN framework convention on sovereign debt.
Okay, and indeed, while the conferences we could not agree on it, I think the idea is here to stay, and with the processes going and starting now at the United Nations, we hope we can get there at some point in time. Well, thank you, Jason. Thanks for sharing your perspectives and insights. It was great to talk to you, great to discuss with you. I wish we could continue, but I think we should probably have a check-in or so in a year or so to see where all these processes stand. And,
Absolutely.
well, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Bodo, and thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Okay. Well, and this was the 4th edition of our podcast series on the reform of the international financial architecture. If you liked our podcasts, please share them. Please give us a like. Please leave a comment. And yeah, it was great to have you following us, watching us. And I hope it was also informative for you as our audience. Thank you very much.